The latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. This is amazing. I shared this video, some part of it with us, and today I am sharing another part of the video whereby a French man is exposing the things that France has been doing in Africa. He went ahead to tell us how these people claim they have given us independence, but they made sure that we continue to depend on France heavily. And France is making sure they use us in order to enrich themselves because we are so much dependent on them for everything. And in return, they get everything that they want from Africa. It's like basically the independence that they gave us wasn't independence. And that was why Dr. Kwame Nkrumah said, political independence without economic independence is meaningless. And that is exactly what we have in Africa today, to the point that we can never do anything for ourselves. And rightly stated how France is doing this and making sure they continue to get what they want from Africa, that they give us puppet leaders that they can easily control. They have destabilized a lot of countries. And when they come to you and you are not doing their bid, they know what to do to you. This is not strange. Like, according to the Russian intelligence, that France is planning to make sure they do away with African leaders that do not serve the interests of Paris. So this is what these people have been doing for all these years to Africa. And like Paul Biya, he said Paul Biya has been in office for a very long time before he even came into this world. And Paul Biya is still the president because France wants it that way. Through Paul Biya, France continue to take what they want out of Cameroon. And they know how to bring leaders to replace others. So they will continue to make sure they fight all nations that are not doing their bid.
Fresh start from 1958 to 1960. France granted independence to all of its African colonies, except Algeria, which only became independent in 1962. But behind this facade of independence, imperialist domination continued. This is what has been called, as I mentioned earlier, Francafrique, France-Africa. The idea was that these large colonial territories I mentioned earlier, the AOF and the AEF, were divided into several states, specifically structured to remain economically dependent on French imperialism. Notably, debt was used as a weapon. These newly independent states were forced to take on massive debt from Paris to guarantee their continued dependence on French imperialism. This remains true even today. In 2022, the total debt owed by African countries to France amounted to 17 billion euros. Under these conditions, these countries are inevitably dependent on Paris and inevitably subjected to pressure from Paris. Similarly, these are countries that are nominally independent, but there's a particular detail. They do not control their own currency. Almost all of these former colonies, except Guinea and one or two others, use a currency, the CFA franc, which is controlled by the Bank of France and printed in Paris. Thus, you have sovereign nations whose currency is not under their control, not even printed in their own capital cities, but printed in the capital of another country, which decides how much they're allowed to have, at what exchange rate, etc., etc. In other words, the economies of these countries, including their finances, remain entirely under the control of French imperialism, which installs utterly corrupt regimes at their helm. Regimes whose power relies entirely on direct support from the French military. In Cameroon, for example, Paris installed President Amadou Ahidjo in power, who ruled from 1960 to 1982. That's a constant. It's often leaders who stay in power for a very long time, because they have something that's better than anything else. To win an election, it's the French Foreign Legion. When they are about to lose an election, or when they are threatened with losing power for one reason or another, they have the Foreign Legion. And so, Ahidjo remains in power for 22 years, while the French army, before independence, then officially the Cameroonian army, but which in reality is an army whose rank-and-file soldiers are Cameroonian, whose officers, general staff, command structure, etc., are French or overseen by French personnel. Thus, while the French army, then the Cameroonian army, bloodily crushed the uprising of anti-imperialist militants from the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, we have an article on this issue, specifically about Cameroon, on our website. I recommend you read it, which explains precisely this facade-like independence process, purely superficial, and these French military interventions, to ensure the maintenance of a pro-French regime have multiplied. It's almost a constant, in fact, in the functioning of French imperialism. In Chad, for example, the French army intervened 5 times since 1969 to support or overthrow an existing regime. And these aren't things of the past. The most recent French military intervention in Chad to support a regime was in 2019, when the French Air Force bombed northern Chad to defend Idriss Déby's regime, who has now died but who in 2019 had been in power since 1990 and ruled by crushing his opponents, looting the country and selling entire sectors to French corporations. Between 1990 and 1994, the French army intervened in Rwanda to support the racist, anti-Tutsi regime of President Habyarimana, and by the end of this period, in 1994, it intervened during the height of the Tutsi genocide to assist the genocidaires and cover their retreat as they fled towards Zaire after losing the civil war. And throughout this entire time, under the protection of the French army, and with the complicity of corrupt local leaders, French companies continued to reap enormous profits. Recall the quote from Jacques Chirac I mentioned earlier. Without this direct domination over Africa, French imperialism would not have been as profitable for French capitalists. The oil company Elf, for example, which later became Total following a massive corruption scandal in the 1980s-90s, it was a cornerstone of Africa's exploitation, and even a pillar of French policy in Africa. Elf's accounts and finances were used to bribe leaders, pay mercenaries, fund state expenses, etc., because it was not subject to parliamentary oversight, unlike the public budget. Thus, in 1998, Africa accounted for 70% of Elf Group's total production. By then renamed Total, the Gulf of Guinea alone represented 48% of that production. You had entire French companies and major corporations, large monopolies like Total, that were entirely dependent on the exploitation of Africa. But starting in the early 2000s, the long decline of French neocolonialism became increasingly pronounced. Gabriel mentioned this earlier, the decline of French neocolonialism, but concretely, France's trade balance became deficit in 2003, and it has never ceased to be so since then. On the contrary, this deficit has only worsened, particularly following the 2008 crisis. And within the context of French imperialism's decline, which was losing more and more market share to new imperialist competitors, France also had to relinquish positions, and has also tried to confront increasingly stronger competition in its traditional spheres of influence in Africa. And there was a study published in 2018 by Coface, a subsidiary of Natixis, which highlighted that France saw its market share in Africa drop from 11% to 5% between the years 2000-2017. Thus, there has been a halving of the market share held by France in Africa over a period of barely 17 years, and there is a whole series of rivals, as I mentioned, who have intervened in Africa to try to compete with French imperialism. As early as the 1990s, you had the United States beginning to intervene increasingly in Africa, and in 1997, they helped topple the regime of the old dictator Zaïs Mobutu, who was an ally of French imperialism in general, and reportedly a personal friend of figures like Charles Pasqua, Jacques Chirac, as well as François Mitterrand. What's his name again? Laurent Roland Dumas. People like that. So you see individuals from the Socialist Party, figures from the right, who all took handouts from Mobutu and provided him support whenever he needed it. But then, American backing enabled the overthrow of Mobutu and his replacement with a new regime, the regime of Joseph Kabila, who was not anti-imperialist, but rather aligned with American imperialists. And other imperialist powers of smaller scale have come to compete with France in Africa. Even Italy has been struggling for several years. That is, for nearly a decade now, with France for control of Libya, for example, after Gaddafi's fall.
We must understand that where things are, we need to fight to make sure we break away from that chains. For how long will Africa continue to stay here for people to use us to their advantage? Like Paul Biya, for instance, this man don't even know where he is. And this is the same person over 90 years, still a president of Cameroon. How? But as long as it serves the oppressor, it's okay. If it were to be somebody who is doing something genuine for Africans, These are the people who come out and be making noise to the whole world that now this person is a dictator per a lot of reasons that they will give out, like they did to Muammar Gaddafi. But because these people serve their interests, we are seeing the same thing happen in Togo, where for Nyasungbe Yadama is still the president. He doesn't want to move, and he has even changed the constitution to remain in office for life. These ones, the West and America would not see anything wrong as long as it serves their interests. The only time you see them targeting a leader in Africa is when the leader is not doing their bid. They force the Sahelian nations to keep their currency in France, just to make sure France continue to exist. Without Africa, France can never exist because they have nothing that they can live on. Their power, their strength, all come from Africa. And when they finish, they change the narrative to make sure you, the African, you lose the power that you have. Because when we know how powerful we are, we will rise to fight to maintain or protect that power. But when you don't know how powerful you are, other people take advantage of you. And that is why, even though they are no longer with us, but they left systems that will work on their behalf. So on paper, you, the African, you are free. But in reality, we are never free. We are still much under slavery. And this one is even dangerous because Nkrumah made it clear to us that the new form of colonization is dangerous in the sense that you don't see the chains so you can fight to set yourself free. But the chains, they are in the mind. This is what is making it so difficult for us to rise together to fight because you don't see that you are still in bondage. And for that matter, we enjoy the little freedom we claim we have. And for how long will we continue to live in the dark? A lot of information about what they are doing to us is out there. We still love to be slaves because you still find the youth of Cameroon supporting Paul Biya. You find youth in Ivory Coast supporting Alassane Ouattara. You find youth in Togo supporting for Nyasungbe Yadama. For all these things that they are doing, the African will never see beyond these things. And for that matter, we'll continue to follow these leaders as long as we have one or two interests in whatever they do. We don't look beyond what they present to us. We hear a lot of things concerning what these our leaders are doing. It's left unto this generation to fight for the total liberation of the African, or we perish, like our all-in-all Captain Ibrahim Traore said. It's either we unite now and fight, or we perish forever. Because if we didn't know, now we do. We know the people who are behind all the destabilization, all the things that are happening in Africa just to make sure we never move forward. And these are the people who sit there and tell you, the African, you are lazy, you are good at singing and dancing. So this is the time for us all to rise up, united to set the continent free. We are the only ones that can set ourselves free. United we stand, divided we fall. And united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world. In Europe, in France,